Góðan daginn, ég heiti Runa og ég er íslensk húsfreyja frá Landnámsúl. Gettu í bæinn og ég skal segja þér frá því hvernig ég bý til efnið sem ég klæði fjölskylduna mína. And again in English, that's hello. My name is Runa, and actually that is a pseudonym that I use for anything to do with Iceland. My name is actually Carla King. And come into my farmhouse and I will tell you about the process I use to make the fabric with which I clothe my family. Sheep, the wool that they produce, and the cloth that could be produced from that wool were incredibly important to Iceland, right from the settlement period up until very close to modern times. When Iceland was settled, the settlers were wearing clothing made primarily from linen and wool. That's actually what I'm wearing today. I'm dressed in a reasonable approximation of what an Icelandic housewife would have worn, although they probably wouldn't have had fire engine red wool like I have. And this stark white linen would have been really expensive. But the underdress here, the white is linen. The red overdress is a very fine wool that I purchased commercially. I didn't need this. But it's probably pretty similar to what they would have been able to produce in the settlement era and from then on. Linen turned out to be the less useful of the materials for Iceland because it comes from a plant. And Iceland has a very limited amount of arable land, which turned out to be better used for growing food crops. There's plenty of land in Iceland that is not arable, and that was perfectly fine for grazing sheep on, but they couldn't use it to produce crops. So in comparison, the relative ease of transporting, breeding, and raising sheep, and the fact that it was a triple purpose animal, namely fiber, meat, and milk, made wool win out when it came to producing clothing. Which is why it eventually was used as a currency. When Iceland was first settled, silver was the primary form of the currency, but it had all been brought with the settlers to the country. So this eventually became dominantly held by the powerful chieftains or gothi. By the end of the settlement period, it had been replaced as a currency by the woolen cloth, and I'm pretty sure that's partly due to it being a renewable resource. When the Althing, which was the name for the Icelandic government, was formed in 930, legal standards and values were already starting to be determined for vatmál, which is the name that was given to the woven cloth. By the Commonwealth era, the cloth could be used as currency for legal transactions, paying fines, and so on. The unit of measurement they used for vatmál was the L, which was 49.2 centimeters, a piece of vatmál that was 2 L's wide by 6 L's long, which equates to roughly 1 meter by 3 meters, was considered one unit of the currency called an eivir, and it was equivalent to the value of 1 ounce of silver. It had to be woven in a 2-2-12 pattern, and there were also regulations regarding how fine the fabric had to be. This was the basic unit of measurement for all types of trade in Iceland. The size of an L did change over the years, largely due to adding the British Isles as a trading partner. It has even been discovered in recent years that because cloth production was such a big thing in Iceland, it ended up affecting Icelandic DNA right up to modern times. There are studies of mitochondrial DNA in modern Icelanders that have been done that show a large amount of genetic input from the Celtic countries among the female settlers, much higher than in men. And I won't go into it, but this is because of how the XY chromosomes are passed on. Dating of textile finds in Iceland and then Scotland, Ireland, and Isle of Man, which are the Celtic countries, show that Celtic women were likely brought to Iceland to provide extra labor in cloth production process, and their extensive knowledge of cloth production eventually influenced a change in techniques, whether that was the direction that the thread was spun or the patterns that were woven into the fabric, that kind of thing. So the project I did for this presentation was just one small part of an overarching project that I've been working on for a while. The goal is to go from raw fleeces to an apron dress like the one I'm wearing today, doing all of the steps myself and building most of the tools myself when possible. But this part of it is just covering the building of the loom and weaving a small piece of the fabric. So I've used the term apron dress, which I mentioned is the garment, the overgarment that I'm wearing here in the red. It's the same one that you see in these pictures. It was also called a hangerrock, and it was basically a tube that was flared at the bottom, kind of like a skirt, but it had straps, and it was worn over an underdress that was usually long sleeved. And the straps go over the shoulders and are fastened by these brooches. They often had beads suspended between the brooches like I have, although I have way more than they would have had in the settlement period. I make these, so that's why. In the settlement period, they would have had maybe one strand and they wouldn't be all matchy-matchy. In these pictures, you see one of my Viking dogs. This is Elsa, my Norwegian elk hound. When she was about 8 to 10 weeks old, she's now 5, so this is a little old. That was a breed that wasn't found in Iceland, but they were in Norway. I also have an Icelandic sheepdog. You'll see one of them later on in this presentation. I'm wearing a different underdress in these pictures made of blue linen, but this white one is also linen. So about the Icelandic sheep. I personally think they're one of the cutest sheep breeds out there. They're quite small, comparatively. They have a double coat, which has 2 layers of very different properties, kind of like a double-coated dog, which there's both the Norwegian elk hound and the Icelandic sheepdog happen to be. It used to be that all sheep had these characteristics, but they were bred out of most of the breeds of sheep that are out there. Icelandic is one of the few breeds that still have it, which makes them fairly unique. Not 100% unique, but quite. The name for the undercoat is the fell, and the outer coat is called the tog, and it can either be separated and prepared separately or combed all together and prepared together to achieve different types of yarn. I'm pretty sure that in the settlement period, they just combed it all together and didn't separate it. The tog, the outer coat, can actually get really, really long, and it's full of lanolin, which is an oil. And it's this lanolin that helps it be so water resistant or waterproof. If you're going to separate it, you need to use wool combs. And I'm going to explain what those are shortly. So here we have a picture of some wool combs. I have those with me right here. They are quite a bit smaller than what would have been used in the settlement period, but made out of very similar things, wooden handles and metal tines. These ones are steel. In the settlement period, they would have been iron. In this picture on the left, which comes from a book about all the things that have been dug up in pagan grave digs in Iceland, and the fact that they're the pagan graves is significant because that dates them to no later than 1000. But it also, that's why there's so much in the graves, because once Iceland converted to Christianity, the burial rites were different and they weren't buried with worldly goods. In the picture here, I mean, to me, it looks like a piece of rusty iron. It's been determined to be the set or the tines from a set of wool combs. And of course, the wooden parts would have long decomposed. They likely would have had just 1 row of the tines. This has 2 rows. Which actually makes the wool catch quite a lot when I'm trying to comb them. I've worked with a set with single tines and they work much better. So here's some pictures from the process of processing the fleece. Now I will mention that the thread I used in my project is not this stuff that I'm processing here. I purchased some commercially spun wool thread to weave with. The amount of time it's going to take me to make enough yarn for the end garment is way more than I had available to me at the time. So in the pictures here on the left is the fleece. It's right off the sheep, but it has been washed once. And then on the right, it's that same fleece that's been separated into the fluffy fell, the undercoat, and the coarser, longer tog with the wavy bits at the end. And I also have some here with me. So this is more of the undercoat, the fell. You can see it's nice and fluffy and it's almost white. I've washed this. This is some unwashed fleece, and it hasn't been separated either. And it's still, so it's because it hasn't been separated, it's still got the wavy bits of the tog, which can be pulled out like this and set aside for weaving or spinning very strong yarn. And if I hold them up together, you can see the color difference. The yellowy nature of this one here is because it hasn't been washed and there's a lot of lanolin left in it. And here, while I was working on processing some, I wanted to see how long a lock of the tog was. So I measured it against my lanyard for my keys because I didn't have a measuring tape with me. Turned out to be 16 inches long, which is really quite long, and would, if it's separated and spun together on its own, will make a very strong yarn. And then we have some pictures of my first Icelandic sheepdog, Thorny, helping me clean the fleece. These pictures are a few years old. She's actually about 4 now, and is actually gone back to living with her breeder on her farm. And I have another one running around here somewhere, but he didn't want to help me with my video tonight. But I have a little boy, golden boy, named Lunti, which is the Icelandic word for puffin. So once you had your fleece prepared, you needed to spin it into thread or yarn. And the difference between the two is basically just the fineness of the strand. In the picture on the left, we have some modernly made in the style of the settlement era drop spindles with soapstone whorls on them for weight, and then a distaff which has been dressed with prepared fleece. The whorls were most often soapstone, but there is no soapstone in Iceland, so they would have been imported from Norway. Of course, no shafts have survived because they were wooden and would have rotted, but there are hundreds of the whorls that have been found in Iceland, which 3 of which are shown in this picture on the right-hand side. And then we get to the loom itself, which is the workhorse of the whole process, other than the person. In the past period, it was called the Vefstaðr, which technically means the place for weaving. But that was the name for the loom itself. And it was used for almost all of the weaving from the settlement of Iceland up to the middle of the 18th century. And I say most of because they did do a bit of card weaving, but not very much. But that was done actually probably usually just taking it and attaching it to something on one end, and then the other end of it was in your hands. This took place up to the year 1000 in a special building called a dingja, which was a weaving hut. They would be really small, big enough to hold the loom, a few women, some stools, and some other supplies, but that's about it. Eventually, the weaving moved into the baðstofa inside the house. That's the main section where almost all of the inside activities would occur. It's a very simple style of loom. It uses the warp itself with weights attached to the bottom to keep the warp taut. That's where the name of it came from. And most of them at the time were big enough that they would have taken 2 people to weave on them. I created mine specifically narrower so that I could do it myself, because I didn't have a second person to rely on that I could have help me. Now, just a little bit on the proof of use of these way back in history. There's other sources, but one of the most interesting ones, in my opinion, is in Daradaliol, which is a skaldic poem found in chapter 157 of Njál's Saga. In it, 12 Valkyries weave to choose who is to be slain at the Battle of Clontarf, which was fought outside Dublin, Ireland in 1014. The loom is described as being made using weapons and human body parts. It paints a really grisly picture of this structure where the loom weights are the human heads, the warp threads are the entrails of the men that have already fallen in battle, the heddle rods are the spears, and so on. And I've just shown a picture of the book, which was one of my primary resources when researching for this project, and also for a paper I later did in the same class, which delves much more deeply into the importance of the cloth. I've skipped taking pictures of every step of building the loom because it's so simple. It's basically just a big rectangle, and then it's got a few dowels across it for various purposes. In the settlement period, it likely would have been made from whatever materials they could find, which is exactly what I did when I made it. In my case, it just happened to be 2x4s and some dowels. In period, young trees cut down, already found, already fallen, using natural forked branches, etc. I've built this one to be able to accommodate any pattern that has been designed for a 4-shaft loom, because eventually I want to do this pattern you can see in the background of the slides, which is called a broken diamond twill. That's not the pattern I did for this piece of weaving. So the warping process is brings in this card weaving. Those little things you can see in the middle of those threads are the cards. I only used 8 for this because I didn't need a very wide piece. On the picture on the right, you can see that band at the top of the right-hand edge of the weaving. And this was how to get it onto the loom. Once that band was created, it could be attached to a big rod at the top of the loom that the fabric would be rolled onto as it's created. I added weights in the settlement era, and later they very likely would have used rocks with natural holes in them because those are really common in Iceland. But you could also use clay weights, and there are lots of those that have been found as well. For this project, I used bags of sand because they were accessible and it was easy to adjust the weight if I needed to, which I ended up needing to do. The whole process, it takes quite a long time to actually get ready to weave. And I've heard a quote that the weaving itself is the reward for putting in the time setting up the loom, because it's can be quite disproportionate unless you set up a very, very long warp for yourself. There are different steps that can happen depending on what pattern you're going to use. I ended up not needing a lot of them because I did a very simple over-under pattern. And then finally I was able to do some weaving. I moved the heddle bars, which were those smaller dowels towards the bottom of the loom, back and forth to create a shed, which is a space between the front and the back threads, so that the weft thread, which is on a separate shuttle, which was just a long, skinny piece of wood that the yarn could be wrapped around, so that it could be put through the center of that space to create the actual weaving. The next few pictures are just different points in the weaving process. It's not fast. It took me months to get all of this completed. I had actually planned way in advance of even starting the class because I knew what I wanted to do for a project. Here's a few inches of fabric woven. As you can see, it's very uneven. There's gaps, all just part of the learning process because I was new to this. And here is a picture of my finished fabric, and as close up as I could get. I ended up stopping after 7.5 inches of fabric, even though I had set the loom up to make a couple of meters worth if all went well. But due to my foibles being new to this project, some of the threads got weakened. I had a lot of breaks, and eventually it was just so frustrating that I said, okay, that's enough for my first project. I have enough for my to show for what I did, and I'm just going to take it off the loom and I'll start again later. So now that I have ended the presentation and you can see me full screen, I will hold up the actual piece of fabric that I wove here. And hopefully my camera will cooperate with me because I'm using a fake background. There we go. So it was 7.5 inches long. It doesn't look that long anymore, probably because it's been shifted around and stuff. And I think it's about 10 inches wide. I'm actually going to turn it into a little tapestry. I might embroider on it to hang on my wall to just show this is my first weaving project.